I cleaned out my grandfather's attic. He wasn't just a priest, he was a witch hunter. Part 1. Chapter 1, The Funeral. They buried my grandfather in a rainstorm no one else seemed surprised by. It wasn't a downpour. Not theatrical. Just the kind of cold, steady drizzle that seeps into your bones and stays there. The cemetery was older than the town itself, all cracked stones, leaning iron fences, and half-forgotten names clawed into lichen-stained granite. Father Marius Lorne. Beloved priest. Devoted servant of God. 1942 to 2023. I stood there with one hand in my coat pocket and the other holding an umbrella that did nothing to stop the wind. 5 people showed up. 2 I didn't recognize. One was the church's janitor. Another was the altar boy, maybe 17, who looked like he'd been forced to come. The last was a woman named Eleanor who ran the floral shop. She dropped off the lilies and didn't stay. No sermon. No priest. Just the dirt. And me. No family either. Not anymore. My parents were long dead, a car crash when I was 12. After that, Marius raised me, though he rarely spoke unless it was through a prayer or a warning. He fed me, clothed me, schooled me in Latin and catechism like I was destined to inherit a church. I left as soon as I was old enough to. I never looked back. Now here I was, 20 years later, standing over his grave with no eulogy and no one to say goodbye. He died quietly, they told me. In his sleep. Heart failure. No foul play. No suspicion. No last rites. The town didn't grieve. That was what I noticed most. No black ribbons on doors. No candlelit vigils. Just silence. Like a shadow had lifted and no one wanted to name what had kept it there. Back at the house, his house, everything was still exactly as I remembered it, austere, cold, built like a cathedral with windows that never let in the sun. Crucifixes in every room. Framed saints on the walls. Books stacked like altars, dusted but unread. The lawyer had given me the keys and one envelope. Clean it out. Sell it if you like, he'd said. He left it to you. All of it. The envelope was sealed with wax. Not modern wax either, old, brittle, red and imprinted with a symbol I didn't recognize. A ring of thorns around a cross, with 3 dots below it. Inside was a letter. Handwritten. Tight, meticulous script. Jonah. There are things I could never tell you. Things I thought I buried with prayer and fire. But I was wrong. I always knew I would be. When the rain comes, go to the attic. The truth is waiting. But it knows you're coming. Do not open anything that bleeds. Do not speak her name. And above all, finish what I could not. Marius. I stared at the letter for a long time. The paper smelled faintly of incense and something like burnt rosemary. I checked the date, written just 3 days before he died. I looked up. The attic door was still shut. Still locked. I hadn't stepped foot in it since I was a child. He'd always kept it sealed with a padlock and a string of rosary beads. Told me it was just for storage. That night, the house didn't creak. It breathed. I didn't sleep. Because every time I closed my eyes, I saw that grave. And I swear I heard something moving above my room. In the attic. Chapter 2, The Attic Key. The morning after the funeral, the house felt heavier than it had the night before. Not just in the air, but in the walls, as if something had uncoiled during the night and was now slithering silently between the old beams and floorboards. I told myself it was grief. Or sleep deprivation. Or the fact that this house always had a way of pressing down on me, even when I was young. I started cleaning. The first floor was exactly as I remembered, immaculate, symmetrical, empty of warmth. My grandfather kept his living room like a museum. The bookshelves were still full of volumes in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. Some had little handwritten tabs sticking out, all with coded markings. His bedroom was a different story. The bed hadn't been made, and a glass of water sat on the nightstand, evaporated to a ring. I opened the closet and found only a few suits, mostly black, and several long priest's robes. Beneath them, an old leather satchel with a broken clasp and a faint scent of mold and candle wax. Inside the satchel, a worn Bible. It didn't look special at first. The spine was cracked, the gold lettering mostly worn away. But as I flipped through it, something clinked against the inside cover. There, carefully stitched into the leather lining beneath the cover page, was a small slit, like it had been cut with a scalpel. Inside it was a key. Not a modern house key. An old brass skeleton key, blackened with age and oddly warm to the touch. I held it in my palm for a moment, feeling its weight, the way it seemed to settle into my skin like it belonged there. It didn't match the front door. Or the basement. Or the shed out back. That left one possibility. The attic. I hadn't thought about it in years, but the moment the thought struck me, I saw it perfectly in my mind, the door at the end of the upstairs hall, sealed with a rusted iron padlock and a strip of rosary beads that used to clack like bones when the wind hit the window. My grandfather had always been firm, that door stays shut. You don't go up there. That's not a place for children. And I hadn't. Until now. I climbed the stairs slowly, the old wood groaning beneath my weight. The hallway hadn't changed, faded wallpaper, crucifix above the window, the stale scent of incense baked into the floor. At the far end, the attic door. It looked smaller than I remembered. Or maybe I was just bigger now. The lock was still in place, rusted and cold. The rosary was gone. I hesitated only a moment before fitting the key into the lock. It turned too easily. Like it had been waiting. The lock popped with a metallic snap, and the door creaked inward an inch. I stood there, hand on the knob, heart thudding in my chest, suddenly unsure if I really wanted to know what was behind it. What kind of priest needed a padlock on his attic and a key hidden inside a mutilated Bible? What kind of man wrote, "Do not open anything that bleeds," in a farewell letter? I pushed the door open. It was dark inside. Not just unlit, but dark. Like the kind of dark that hangs in old churches or deep caves. The smell hit me next, dust, candle soot, something earthy and metallic underneath it all, like dried blood and root rot. I reached for the pull cord hanging from the ceiling and gave it a tug. The single light bulb flickered on, casting a pale yellow circle of light. And in that circle, I saw them. Books. Tools. Symbols drawn in chalk on the floor. A crucifix made of iron and thorn. And in the far corner, half covered in a white sheet like a corpse, was something large and sealed in chains. My grandfather had been many things. But now, I knew, he hadn't just been a priest. He'd been something else. Chapter 3, The Attic. The attic wasn't dusty. That was the first thing I noticed. No thick cobwebs, no forgotten boxes buried in mouse droppings and rot. Everything was preserved. Arranged. Maintained. Like someone had been up here regularly. Recently. The bulb overhead buzzed with a faint hum, swaying slightly from the pull of the string. Its flickering cast shadows that moved just a heartbeat out of rhythm with me. There were no windows. No vents. And yet the air felt alive, not stale, not dead. More like the hush in a cathedral just after a funeral mass ends. Reverent. Waiting. My boots creaked softly against the wood as I stepped fully inside. To my left, a long bench lined with tools. Not handyman tools. Instruments. There were iron nails arranged in bundles, each tied with red thread. Wooden stakes carved with Latin script along the grain. A leather roll filled with scalpels, glass vials, and bones, not animal bones, either. Human, by the size and shape. Small ones. A bundle of dried herbs hung from a beam overhead, rosemary, sage, yew, and something else I didn't recognize, twisted with what looked like dried fingernail clippings tied into the stems. A cabinet stood against the back wall. Open. Inside, dozens of glass jars filled with strange contents. Hair. Teeth. Ashes. Blood that hadn't coagulated. Each labeled in precise handwriting. Mare's breath. Witch's fire. Knotted cord, third binding. To the right was a trunk. Large. Black. Sealed with an iron latch that looked like it had been soldered shut. Carved into the lid were protective sigils I remembered from the margins of my grandfather's old Bibles, circles intersecting thorns, eyes inside crosses, a burning hand holding a key. I didn't open it. Not yet. Instead, I turned toward the far wall, where an old cedar bookshelf leaned slightly, too full for its frame. Books, journals, notebooks stacked in layers. Many of them bound in rawhide. All unlabeled, except one. A thick, cracked leather ledger. A single label on the spine. Names, not all accounted for. The words hit like a breath of cold air. Something in my stomach turned. I pulled it down and opened the cover. The pages inside were old. Yellowed. The ink had bled in places, but the names were still legible, handwritten in dense, neat script. A list that stretched on for page after page. Emily T. Corvin Hale. Sister Magdalene. Elias Blackroot. Wren. Wren, child. Wren, deceased. Father Elijah, returned. Mora, marked but not burned. Dozens of them. Some names were crossed out. Some had annotations, contained. Cleansed. Buried in salt. But several were marked differently, circled in red or followed by a single, chilling word. Unresolved. I flipped to the final page. There, alone on the paper, was a name I recognized from the letter. Mora. No surname. No location. Just one note beneath it. She vanished. Not dead. Not gone. She waits for blood that doesn't know the vow. My hands shook. I closed the book. Because that's when I noticed it, in the exposed grain of the attic floor, arranged with chalk that hadn't been disturbed in years. A protection circle. Thorned. Double-layered. Scripted in Latin I could barely read. But one section was rubbed away. Smeared. Broken. Like someone, or something, had stepped out of it. The attic was a time capsule, yes. But something inside it had moved. Something had gotten loose. Chapter 4, The Journals. I spent the rest of the day in the attic. It wasn't a decision so much as a compulsion. Once I cracked open the first journal, the house itself seemed to lean in, as if it wanted me to read, to remember something I'd never known in the first place. There were dozens of journals stacked in the corner, arranged by color-coded thread along the spines, red, black, and white. The red ones came first, entries beginning around 1946, the year my grandfather was ordained, according to his obituary. But these weren't the writings of a new priest eager to save souls. These were records of encounters. The handwriting was tight, spare, but clear. And the tone, nothing like the solemn, dutiful priest I remembered. These pages belonged to a man who lived in a world with monsters and had chosen to hunt them. June 17, 1947. Confirmed possession in the Black Hollow family. Third son, 11 years of age. Symptoms: convulsions, corpse mimicry, ink bleeding from the mouth. When confronted with the sacrament, the child laughed in the voice of an adult woman. Latin reversed. Language unknown. Binding incomplete. Subject expired during third attempt. Burned remains in salt and fire. Buried at crossroads behind St. Anselm's. The language chilled me. Cold. Methodical. Like a scientist documenting a field experiment, except the subject was a human child. And these weren't one-offs. The entries kept going. July 3, 1951. Coven signs in the East Parish. Wards on graveyard were tampered with. Discovered animal offerings, tongues, hooves, one skinned rabbit, arranged in the shape of a broken wheel. Tracked activity to the Harper Girl, see Red Ledger Volume 3. Engaged. Denied guilt. Tested silver. Failed. Intervention required. The word intervention occurred dozens of times. Always after accusations. Always followed by cryptic notes: contained, cleansed, vanished. There were no official reports, no mention of police or church authorities. Just names, dates, methods. He wasn't documenting evil. He was erasing it. And not alone. A few entries listed initials: E.L., Sister M. W., sometimes accompanied by notations like held circle or second chant. There were others. A small group, operating without oversight. Witch hunters, bound not by law, but by ritual. Somewhere around 1968, the tone changed. Sharpened. He started using the term, the marked. That's when I found the first mention of her. October 22, 1969. Initials MB. Believed name, Maura Blackvale. Sighting reported near Devil's Hollow. Subject matched the prophecy from the Danvers texts: red eyes, ash-colored teeth, unborn shadow. Attempted approach. Result: seizure. Woke in salt circle, surrounded by fire and broken time. We failed. She left. She waits. It was the first entry in nearly 100 pages to be underlined. The handwriting changed slightly, thinner, shakier. As if written in fear. Or by someone no longer fully themselves. I flipped to the back of the journal. Taped to the inside cover was a small folded piece of parchment paper. On it, in crimson ink, 3 lines. One remains. We failed. She will wait for the bloodline. The rest of the journals only confirmed what that note implied. They'd spent decades tracking witches. Not fairy tale witches. Not Wiccans. But something older. Crueler. Entities in human skin. Some were subtle: seducers, deceivers, spirit leeches. Others were feral and wild, living in bone-strewn cabins with no names and no eyes. But all were connected by one thread. The Black Veil line. Maura Blackvale. No date of birth. No death certificate. No grave. She was in the first journal, and she was in the last. Always there in the margins. Watching. No matter how many names were crossed out, hers never was. I sat in the attic for hours, surrounded by the scratch of old leather, the bitter scent of wormwood and dried blood ink. I felt it in my spine, a pressure, like the house was holding its breath. I ran my fingers down the edge of the final journal. And there, under the very last entry, in a trembling, final line of ink that had bled into the page, my grandfather had written: I hear her whisper in my sleep. She is not bound. She is beneath. She waits for Jonah. I did not mean to fail him. My name. My name in a journal written before he died. In a hand not used in years. The attic seemed to pulse around me. A sound like wood creaking in reverse. I stood up, heart hammering. And I realized. There were no clocks in the attic. But somehow, it was dark outside. I'd broken his first rule. Don't stay past sundown. And now? Something was awake. Chapter 5, The Last Name. By the time I came back down from the attic, the house no longer felt like it belonged to me, if it ever had. The journal stayed upstairs, but I brought the ledger of names with me. I didn't want it near the tools, the iron, the jars. I didn't even want it near the crosses. I needed to see it in different light. So I sat in the kitchen, turned on the overhead, and opened the book on the scarred old table my grandfather never let anyone touch. The chair creaked beneath me like it remembered who had last sat there. Probably him. The book was older than I thought. Its pages had thinned at the edges and darkened around the corners, like something had passed over it more than once, fire, perhaps. Or time. Or something worse. The names filled the first 50 pages. Lined entries, alphabetical, at first clinical, later increasingly erratic. I saw entire families listed together. Parents and children. Pairs of siblings. Some marked with crosses. Some with circles. A few with nothing at all. But one name appeared more than any other. Not at the front. Not in sequence. Always alone. Always carved into the margins. Mora Blackveil. Sometimes written fully. Sometimes just Mora. Other times, M.B. Once, Mother Blackveil. No birthdate. No location. No bloodline trace. No known death. Every time the name appeared, it was scratched out, violently, gouged until the paper nearly tore. Then written again. In red ink. In pencil. In something I wasn't sure was ink at all. It was obsessive. As if writing her name down made her more real. Or kept her away. As if forgetting her was a door left open. I traced my finger over one such entry. Mora Blackveil, marked but not consumed. Regenerates. Disincarnate. Eyes like coal. Voice like your own. Then on the next page. Not dead. Not gone. She vanished. The word vanished repeated 3 times in progressively worse handwriting. And finally. A page near the back. No other names. Just hers. Written 10 times. Each scratched out again. And beneath it, in barely legible script, smeared with something that looked like rust. I saw her once, not in person. In the mirror. She knew my name before I was born. She isn't a woman. Not anymore. She's a silence that wants a mouth. My skin crawled. Something about the wording felt off. Not just disturbing, but personal. As if the sentence hadn't been meant for the page, but for me. Like it had waited to be read. The house made a sound behind me. A soft wooden groan, too low for footsteps. I looked up. The kitchen window had gone dark. Not just from nightfall, but blacker than night. No moonlight. No stars. Just an unnatural void. Like the house had drifted somewhere it didn't belong. I stood slowly. Turned off the kitchen light. And in the faint reflection of the window, I could almost see her. A woman-shaped shadow behind me. Tall. Still. watching. But when I turned around, nothing. Just the quiet house. Just the smell of incense and dust. But I knew. I knew then with a certainty I couldn't explain. She hadn't vanished. She hadn't been defeated. Or banished. Or sealed away. She had waited. Waited for the bloodline to forget. Waited for the wrong door to open. Waited for me. Chapter 6, The Tithe Marks. I couldn't sleep. After what I'd read, after seeing her name again and again in that ledger, the thought of closing my eyes felt like a risk. Like letting go of the only thing keeping her out. So I went back upstairs. Back to the attic. The house resisted me. The stairs moaned louder than before. The air on the second floor had grown heavy, like walking through water. The old hallway crucifix had fallen off the wall. I hadn't heard it drop. When I reached the attic door, I hesitated. The key was still in my pocket, still slightly warm. But the padlock was gone. It sat on the floor now, open. Bent. The rosary beads I'd seen before had reappeared, but not hanging on the doorknob. They were nailed into the door itself in the shape of an X. Something had restored them. Not someone. I opened the door anyway. The light bulb flickered twice, then steadied as I stepped inside. The air had a new scent now, metallic, sweet, and wrong. Like rot in a church incense burner. I set the name ledger aside and went to the far corner of the attic where the floorboards dipped slightly, where my grandfather's old prayer rug still lay, tucked beneath a tall iron crucifix on a wooden stand. I'd ignored it before. The crucifix looked ceremonial. Familiar. A priest's tool. But now I noticed the edges of the rug were frayed in perfect symmetry. The center was slightly discolored, as if something had bled beneath it, then been scrubbed and bled again. I knelt and pulled it back. The wood beneath was carved with symbols. Dozens of them. Circles inside circles. Spirals. Burned crosses. Etched hands. Rows of runes I couldn't read. But not random. They were arranged into a ritual grid, precise and sacred, though not of any Christian rite I knew. Lines had been scraped into the wood, reinforced over time until the grain had splintered around them. The grooves were blackened. Burnt. I ran my hand over one symbol, a spiral wrapped in thorns. The wood was cold. The lines were deep enough to catch a fingernail. Then I touched another, smaller, off to the side. It looked newer, less worn. A simple teardrop with a single line through it. At first it felt like the others. Cold. Dead. But then it grew warm under my skin. Warm, then hot. I pulled my hand back in alarm, and saw blood. Mine. But not just from a cut. The symbol itself had bled. A thin trickle of black-red fluid had seeped up from the wood where I touched it, curling into my palm like ink in water. I backed away, heart hammering. The air around me shifted. I swear the symbols pulsed, once, like a held breath. And then, a whisper. So faint it might have been imagined. Except I knew it wasn't. Jonah. My name. Spoken in a voice that wasn't my grandfather's. Wasn't human. Low, female, and ancient. The crucifix on the wall behind me cracked, one arm snapping loose with a sound like splintering bone. I turned in time to see a sliver of shadow dart from the corner to the rafters above, not moving like a person, but like smoke caught in wind. The attic went still again. But something had changed. I looked down at the symbol, now dry. No blood. Just the carved lines in the wood. Except, one other thing had changed too. Every other symbol in the circle had aged, cracked with time, dulled by dust. But the one I'd touched? It looked fresh. As if it had just been carved. As if it had been waiting. And now it knew me. Chapter 7, The First Return. I locked the attic from the inside. Twice. I slid the old latch across the door, wrapped the rosary back into its original knot, and tucked the name ledger under my arm as I descended the stairs. Every step away from that room felt like backing away from an edge I hadn't seen until I was already halfway over it. The hallway seemed darker than it had before, not in color, but in tone. Like the shadows had thickened in my absence. By the time I reached the kitchen, I realized I was shaking. My hands, my legs, my breath, trembling, as though something had passed through me, not just near me. I poured a glass of water, drank it, then poured another and left it untouched. There was a copper tang in my throat. Not blood. Not quite. Like something had brushed up against my memory and left a residue. I turned on every light in the house. Every room. I didn't care how childish it seemed. I didn't care what the electric bill would be. I just needed to push back the dark. The sun had gone down hours ago. The windows were black mirrors. I caught my reflection in them too many times, each glance more uneasy than the last. I could have sworn that in one pane above the kitchen sink, my reflection wasn't blinking when I did. That was when I heard it. A slow creak. Above me. Then another. And another. Footsteps. In the attic. I froze, holding my breath. Another step. Heavier this time. Then two in quick succession, 1, 2, as if someone was pacing in slow loops above the ceiling. I stared up at the hallway ceiling, willing myself to remember something, anything, rational. But I had locked that door. The latch was inside. The padlock sealed. The rosary still coiled. No one could have gotten in. No one, human. The footsteps stopped. Then the house exhaled, a long groaning creak from the bones of its old wood. And then came the smell. Faint at first. Hard to place. But quickly growing sharper, sweeter, wrong. Burnt sugar. Mixed with something earthy and spoiled. Like dirt from a grave, left too long in the rain. I turned off the stove fan and held still. No sound. No wind. No pipes. Just that scent, thick and clinging, oozing downward as if it had a shape and weight of its own. I moved slowly toward the stairs, half against my better judgment, half out of something deeper, a need to confirm the unconfirmable. Each step groaned. Each shadow seemed to crawl just slightly when I passed. At the top of the stairs, I reached out toward the attic door, toward the padlock. Still locked. The latch untouched. The rosary intact. But the doorknob was warm. Like it had just been held. I didn't open it. Instead, I leaned in, just enough to press my ear to the wood. And from the other side, I heard the whisper again. Faint. Not like before, not calling my name. This time, it was laughing. Dry, breathless. Like wind in a dying throat. I backed away slowly, careful not to turn my back to the door. Every nerve in me screamed to run, but something deeper told me not to break eye contact with the wood. Because even without opening it, I knew. She'd been in the attic. And she wasn't alone. Chapter 8, Town Secrets. The portrait haunted me all night. Even after I covered it again, turned it toward the wall, and tried to forget the mirrored eyes, they lingered behind my eyelids like burns. Every time I blinked, I saw the faint outline of that second figure in the reflection, the woman watching the stairs. She wasn't watching me. She was watching for something else. By morning, I needed answers. Something real. Something grounded. so I drove into town. The roads hadn't changed much. Same cracked asphalt. Same skeletal trees leaning over like they were eavesdropping. The town had always been small, and time had only made it smaller. Main Street was a single stretch of brick buildings, half of them boarded up or hollowed out. The others clung to life, a barbershop, a diner, a thrift store. And the church. St. Gideon's. I parked across from it and stared for a moment. The building was older than anything else in town. Gray stone, tall spire, windows full of saints no one could name anymore. It looked more like a fortress than a house of worship. Inside, it was cold. Always had been. The current priest, Father Raymond, stood at the altar, speaking softly to a couple of parishioners. He was younger than my grandfather had been. Bookish. Nervous eyes. The kind of man who looked like he never quite got over seminary anxiety. When he saw me, his expression stiffened. "Jonah," he said cautiously, coming forward. "You're Marius's grandson." "That's right," I said. "Mind if I ask you something?" He gestured to the pews. We sat. I didn't waste time. "What do you know about what my grandfather really did?" He blinked. He was a priest. I held his gaze. He was something else, too. Silence. The stained glass saints above us watched with hollow eyes. "I found journals," I said. "Names. Rituals. Symbols I've never seen in any scripture. And I found a name he circled again and again. Mora Blackveil." His face went pale, just slightly, but enough to see. He folded his hands in his lap and looked down. "I think it's time you left that house, Jonah." "Why?" "Because Marius was devout. And deeply troubled. He saw sin where others saw sorrow. He believed things. Things like witches." He looked at me, and for the briefest moment, the priest mask slipped. He believed she was real. That he had to keep her locked away. I don't know if he succeeded. I don't know if he failed. He stood then, too quickly. "I'll pray for you." It wasn't dismissal. It was retreat. Outside the church, the wind picked up. Leaves skittered across the pavement in dry whispers. I turned to leave and nearly collided with someone standing near the gate. An old woman. Thin as wire. Wrapped in a black shawl, eyes clouded but sharp. She looked up at me like she had been waiting there for hours. "You're his blood," she said. I froze. She leaned in closer, breath like cloves and dust. "Your grandfather kept her caged. Now she's free." Then she turned, slow and steady, and disappeared into the alley beside the church. I didn't follow. I couldn't. I drove back to the house in silence, every shadow in the trees looking too much like someone watching. Because if she was free, then the cage was already open. And I had walked right into it. Chapter 9, The First Disappearance. It happened the next morning. I was sitting at the kitchen table, flipping through my grandfather's journal again, the red-threaded one, heavy with entries that felt more like field notes from a hunter than anything written by a priest. The page I kept returning to was dated June 3, 1971. It mentioned a girl named Wren, 9 years old, found wandering near the church grounds in a daze, mumbling backwards phrases and clutching dead moths in both hands. "Too late for cleansing," my grandfather had written. The earth already took root in her mouth. I didn't understand what it meant. Not yet. But a few hours later, I heard the sirens. They were faint, maybe half a mile off, but distinct. In this town, you never heard multiple sirens at once unless something serious had happened. By instinct or dread, I found myself walking toward them. The street led toward the far end of town, past the diner, past the school, until it curved around to a thicket of woods just behind St. Gideon's Church. I hadn't been there in years, but the memory came back in pieces: the time-worn trail behind the chapel, the half-collapsed wooden altar deep in the clearing, and my grandfather leading strange, private ceremonies no one in town ever discussed. They called them blessings. But I remembered the way people looked when they came back from them. Hollow. Changed. Quiet for days. When I reached the edge of the trees, I saw them: the sheriff's car, an ambulance, 2 officers speaking in low voices, and a woman standing in the middle of the trail, pale-faced and trembling. I recognized her. Emily Carter. Single mother. Lived 2 doors down from my grandfather's place. I didn't approach. Not directly. I just watched from a distance as she kept repeating the same thing to the sheriff. She was just playing. Just right here. I told her not to go near the woods. I told her. The sheriff tried to calm her, but she shook her head. She said she saw a woman. In the trees. Said the woman had no eyes and a necklace made of teeth. She began to sob. That's when I noticed something else. One of the officers, a younger man, face pale as wax, was holding a small item in a clear plastic evidence bag. A child's shoe. Tiny. Faded pink. Speckled in something dark along the sole. And written in black marker on the insole, barely visible, was a name. Lena. I felt cold wash over me. Because that name, Lena Carter, was one I'd seen just hours earlier. In the journal. On the very next page. Only it hadn't said Lena Carter. It said LC. Pre-marked. Watch the bloodline. Risk of pattern repeat. Proximity to sacred grove is unstable. I didn't tell the officers what I knew. Not yet. Because deep in the trees, past the patrol tape and the parked cruisers, I saw something else. A shadow standing just beyond the old trail. Too tall to be a child. Too still to be a search party volunteer. Draped in dark fabric, head tilted. As if listening. Watching. I blinked, and it was gone. But the smell remained, a sickly sweetness on the air, thick with rot and burnt rosemary. Burnt sugar and grave dirt. Same as the attic. Same as the night the footsteps started. I turned and walked back to the house without saying a word. Because I knew what this meant. Maura had returned. And she wasn't coming for the old. She was coming for the young. Chapter 10, The Black Veil Farm. It took me the better part of a day to find it. I'd returned to the attic that morning, notebook in hand, determined to dig through every piece of paper, every scribbled note, every half-burned map. Somewhere in my grandfather's scrawl, amid the Latin invocations and demonologies, I found it, a faded reference written in the margin of a 1963 journal entry. B. Hollow property, formerly Black Veil Farm. Her land. Her center. Ground still poisoned. Avoid contact. I cross-referenced it with a torn map tucked inside the front of the name ledger. There was no property labeled Black Veil, but there was a stretch of forest west of town known as Black Hollow, and a barely marked path leading to an area with no structures on record. Which meant the place was real, and forgotten on purpose. By noon I was in my truck, driving past the edge of town, then hiking through thick brush and undergrowth that hadn't been walked in decades. The path wasn't a trail, exactly, more like a scar through the forest. Trees here grew warped, as if reaching away from something. The wind was silent. No birdsong. No insects. Just the crunch of my boots and the soft creak of trees that leaned too far in. After an hour of climbing and weaving through deadfall, I found it. Black Veil Farm. What was left of it? The house was a collapsed ruin, half swallowed by the earth, leaning into itself like a corpse mid-decay. The main structure had burned at some point, blackened timber ribs jutted from the soil like a ribcage. But the foundation was intact. So was the stone chimney and the root cellar door at the rear. The land was wrong. The silence was wrong. And when I stepped across the old fence line, my vision blurred for a heartbeat, as if I'd crossed into some thinned place in the world. I forced myself forward. The door to the cellar gave after 3 hard pulls. The iron latch had rusted, but not enough to keep me out. Inside, the air was cold, unnaturally so. Not just damp, but dead. The floor was dirt packed hard. Roots lined the ceiling. And in the center was a circle of stones, not random. Carved with symbols that matched the ones in my grandfather's attic. Within the circle were the remains of small animals, rabbits, squirrels, a fox. All arranged in symmetrical patterns, their spines arched unnaturally, mouths agape, as if caught mid-scream. The bones hadn't yellowed. They were fresh. As if someone, or something, had been here recently. In the far corner stood a tree trunk, hollowed and smooth inside, its bark carved in spirals. It was an altar. I approached it slowly. At its base sat an object wrapped in black lace, tucked beneath a heap of rotting herbs. I reached out with a gloved hand, gently pulled it free. It was a doll. Handmade. Bound with twine. Stuffed with dried flowers and ash. And sewn into its mouth were 6 human teeth. They were small. Childlike. Still streaked with blood at the root. As I stared at it, something shifted behind me. Not sound. Not movement. Air. Like the room had inhaled. I turned, heart pounding. No one was there. But on the dirt floor near the circle, a footprint had appeared, bare, narrow, deep in the heel. And around it, the ground had begun to frost over. My breath fogged. And then I heard it. A voice. Distant. Feminine. Soft as a lullaby, echoing from the hollow of the altar. He broke the circle, so I stepped through. I backed away, nearly stumbling, heart hammering in my chest. As I climbed back into daylight, I noticed something I hadn't before. The trees surrounding the house weren't just dead. They were bending inward, toward the ruin. As if the forest was being pulled to it, like it was the center of gravity for something far older than the house itself. Something alive. Something watching. Chapter 11, The Family Curse. I didn't go straight home after leaving Blackvale Farm. I couldn't. Something about that place clung to me. The chill never left my skin, even hours later. And in the corner of my vision, whether I looked or not, I kept seeing those 6 teeth, stitched into the mouth of that doll, grinning like they'd been waiting for me. I drove the long way back through town, taking the winding side roads, letting the quiet of the forest buffer the pounding in my chest. But no matter how many turns I took, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me out of that cellar. By dusk, I was back at the house. The attic waited like a lung holding its breath. I didn't hesitate this time. I climbed the stairs, unlocked the door, stepped through, and immediately went to the far shelf of journals. I knew what I was looking for now. I knew where the answers would be. My grandfather's writings were organized in a kind of obsessive ritual, red thread for active cases, black for doctrine, white for rights and bloodlines. I pulled the white-bound journal labeled Covenants and Consequences, and flipped to the dog-eared page I'd skimmed days earlier. This time, I read it all. August 12, 1985. The bloodline is marked. Not by sin, but by oath. Every firstborn must take the vow. Without it, she can reach them. Not instantly. Not with force. But slowly. Through doors left open. Through dreams. It must be spoken aloud. With fire. In salt. In God's name and blood's witness. Jonah was too young when his parents died. The rite was delayed. I hoped it wouldn't matter. But last night, I saw her again. In the mirror. She grinned. Not at me, but at the child asleep upstairs. If I die before he takes the vow, she'll come. She's already coming. I sat down hard on the attic floor. I remembered it then, or thought I did. A faint echo of a memory I'd always considered a dream. I must have been 5 or 6. Waking in the night to see my grandfather standing over my bed with a candle in one hand and a bowl of water in the other. He'd muttered something. Traced a mark on my forehead. But he'd stopped. I remember crying. He had looked uncertain. Afraid. He never finished it. He never finished the vow. Which meant I was exposed. Open. And she knew it. The next few pages were instructions, brutal and precise. The child must repeat the vow aloud. Must kneel in a closed circle of iron and salt. The flame must remain lit. If the fire dies before the name is spoken, she has already entered. The name, I realized, meant Mora. My hands trembled. The house groaned around me, like it had heard what I'd read. Like it had been waiting for this revelation. The final line in my grandfather's entry was circled 3 times. She can't take what's been bound. But the unspoken name is hers to claim. A cold breeze swept through the attic. The window didn't move. No doors opened. But a single page from another journal fluttered free and landed in front of me. Not my grandfather's handwriting. This one was mine. At the top was a line written in shaky, familiar script, as if I'd written it years ago but never remembered doing so. Jonah never took the vow. Below it, scrawled as if carved into the paper by a trembling hand. Now she doesn't need permission. I dropped the book and staggered back. Because in the air around me, thick and sweet, came that scent again. Burnt sugar. Grave dirt. And the faintest whisper of rosemary. She wasn't coming. She was already inside. Chapter 12, The Mark Appears. I woke with the weight of a scream in my throat. The house was silent, but not asleep. Not anymore. It felt like it had passed some invisible threshold. Something subtle had turned, the way the floorboards shifted underfoot, the way shadows clung to corners longer than they should. As if the place had been holding back, and finally decided not to. I'd spent the night curled on the couch, the fire dead in the grate, 3 circles of salt laid at every doorframe and windowsill. My grandfather's journal surrounded me, open and scattered like paper wards. But they hadn't helped. I dreamed of the farm. Of the hollow tree altar yawning wider. Of a voice murmuring prayers backward. Of someone, or something, pressing fingers into my skin. When I stood and turned toward the bathroom mirror that morning, I saw it immediately. A bruise, deep and purple-black, just beneath my left shoulder blade. It wasn't random. It had shape. Circular. Twisting. A spiral with jagged thorns radiating outward, the exact same pattern I'd seen carved into the attic floor beneath the rug. The same one that bled when I touched it. I froze. The skin around the bruise was warm. Almost fever-hot. I pulled off my shirt and turned sideways to get a better look. The bruising wasn't raised. It wasn't tender. It pulsed faintly under the surface, as if something moved beneath it. The mark was perfect. A brand without fire. I stepped into the shower, turned the water up as hot as I could stand, and scrubbed. Harder. Until my skin turned raw. Until steam choked the air and the pipes groaned. But the mark wouldn't lift. And then, I heard it. Behind the hiss of the water. A whisper. Faint. Female. Coiled like smoke. Jonah. I froze. The sound wasn't in the pipes. It wasn't in my head. It came from behind me, from just outside the fogged shower door. I turned the water off. Waited. Drip. 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 Silence. I slid open the glass. The bathroom was empty. Except for the mirror. On the surface of the glass, scrawled in long, curling finger trails of steam, was a shape. The same spiral. Only this time, there was a second mark beneath it. An eye. And beneath it, 3 dots. Just like the wax seal on my grandfather's final letter. I stood there, shivering, not from cold, but from something older than fear. Something instinctive. Cellular. Like my body had just recognized a predator it couldn't name. Because now it was clear. The mark wasn't from the dream. It wasn't a warning. It was a claim. A signature. And someone, had already begun writing the rest of the sentence.
The story may end here. But the darkness never sleeps. Like this video to keep the shadows stirring. Share your whispers in the comments. Your voice shapes the next nightmare. And subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Gothic Hour Stories and Mysteries. Where every tale lingers, and every soul leaves a mark, the Gothic Hour awaits.